this computer, and there you go. Hello everybody, welcome to Pen at Prithvi. We're a fortnightly online platform where we talk to writers from India and abroad, writing in English and other languages. And we used to be a physical space, as you know, before the pandemic, under another curator, another convener. And then when the pandemic hit, we moved online and will be online for the foreseeable future. We're a fortnightly program. Follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter, so you know what we're coming up with next. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome Sabita Sachi, whose book is still very, very fresh in my memory, and which kind of blew me away. I'm going to quickly read her bio, and then we are going to delve into the very, very intriguing book. Sabita Sachi is, she has like many. She does a lot of things, right? She teaches, she curates art, she writes poems. She's also a researcher, and today we'll be looking at the poetry side of it more than others, with a brief segue into other stuff as well. Hi, Sabita.
Hello. Lovely to be here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for giving us the time, and congratulations. I do believe, please correct me if I'm mistaken, that this is your debut poetry collection in English.
Yes, it is.
But I should also mention that Sabita has got a huge ton of publications in Malayalam. So she's a bilingual poet in the truest sense of the word, that she's been published a ton in English anthologies and a ton in anthologies in Malayalam. So Sabita, the title of your book is called, the title of your book is Hereafter, and it's published by Poetry Wala, right? Yes. And it came out this year?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit, can you just kind of open the covers of the book for us a little bit?
Yeah, actually, as you can see, I've put these markers to read. Maybe I thought maybe I'll read like 2 or 3 poems.
What a fabulous idea.
Just to introduce the book a little bit.
Yes.
I think it's best that the book introduces itself,
Yes.
So I just sort of marked out a few poems.
What a wonderful idea.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you so much, Suhit, and thank you, Poetry. Thank you, Prithvi, Pen at Prithvi. Yeah. And it's an absolute pleasure to, I really wish it was actually happening in a physical space, but well, in the absence of that, this is definitely the next best thing. And I'm really happy to see you, actually, to see your face and actually to have this face-to-face conversation. What I'll do is I'll delve quickly into a few poems to start off with, and then we can take it from there. We can have a conversation around the
sure thing.
The first poem that I'll read is titled To Paul Celan. Oh, I also wanted to say that this book, this book also has these fantastic drawings, line drawings by artist Madhusudanan. So so it's I'm doing a series actually with Madhu, which is actually which is going to be both poetry and line drawing. So it's in some sense actually this book leads to the next book. So,
fantastic.
Yeah, so it's also kind of introduction to the way I think and work, because I think I do think very visually, and there are poems which directly mention certain artists or certain works,
right.
And even where I don't necessarily refer to a particular artist, I think it's I think there is a kind of visual element, whether it's pyramids geometry, or whether it's the poem to the statues of the Queen Hatshepsut, or so there's a lot of sculptural and line based kind of stuff that happens in these poems, I think. But the one I'm going to start with does not have any of it, but I'll read another one after that. This one is called To Paul Celan. To Paul Celan. Everyone over 40 should be shot, wrote a poet in 1969. The 50-something Jewish poet heard it in 1970 and resolved to drown himself in the Seine. The Seine flowed on 50, 30, 60, 40, 20. Sweet Seine, flow softly until I end my song. Sweet Seine, sing softly until my poem soars. Softly, still softly, candles flickered. Christ, Jehovah, Christ, Jehovah. Whether new or old, testaments will be testaments. A soldier kept counting the heads in some concentration camp. 60, 10, 30, 50, 70,000 and 21. And you, my later roses. Softly, still softly, flowers bloomed in the cemetery. Carl, Rosa, Paul. Be it genocide or suicide, death is death. In a rain of black umbrellas, the priest chanted, Amen. Outside, death. 50, 90, 40. Sweet Seine, flow softly until I end my song. Sweet Seine, sing loudly until my poem flares. Death, scattered candlelight, roses, roses. This poem, as you can see, it refers to not just Paul Celan, but also Carl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and it kind of tries to map out that whole period in the cemetery, really,
Yes, absolutely. It's beautiful.
I do have a habit of, so in some sense, Hereafter is a kind of apt title, I thought, also because, I do pay homage to dead writers or living writers. And, so this book is actually kind of a hereafter or a post note to a lot of poets that have gone before, right? Nobody is a Swayambhu, nobody is born afresh, but, we all come in the wake of those who have gone before. So, saying that, I'll move to the next poem, which is actually from a sequence called Letters to Father, which is this is a series of poems addressed to my father, Sachidanandan, and it's there are certain poems which are actually dialogic with his poetry, and there are certain which also stand alone. So I'll read this one, which was actually written on 15th August, literally. It's fragment 3 from Letters to Father.
Okay.
Kites on 15th August. Kites flying overhead, Father, like only kites can do. Controlled, yet soaring beyond boundary wall, yet entangled with each other, terminal. And we must still sing the freedom songs, the voice hoarse, the lines crooked, tuneless. In her white handspun and broken spectacles, I remember grandmother. There may be some relevance to reading this on 2nd October when, this is about the disillusionment with nationalism in some sense, this poem.
Yes.
And I do have actually a poem directly on Gandhi, except that it's in Malayalam. That's a new poem, sometimes I kind of leave things in one language and don't go between them.
Right.
So yeah, but this poem kind of, in a way, it talks to today, the disillusionment with nationalisms, actually, not just one, but many.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And maybe I'll read one more. This is also from a sequence, the sequence from which actually the book derives its title. the sequence is titled Travels in the Hereafter, and this is a sequence actually on Egypt. So I traveled in Egypt for some time, and this sequence was born out of that. Now this poem actually, it refers to it's something very startling, right? I mean, along the banks of the Nile, you come across a temple called the Hatshepsut Temple, and as soon as you walk in, it's quite a massive temple actually, and as soon as you walk in, you see scores and scores of these sculptures, the statues of a woman, clearly a ruler. She's carrying all the iconographic things of power, and even though that figure wears a skirt, it has a beard, right? So this it's something quite interesting, and then I actually started reading up on Hatshepsut and who she was, and she was the only woman pharaoh in Egypt. So this poem is in some sense addressed to her, the queen who would be king. It's from the sequence called Travels in the Hereafter. At the doorways to the temple, a bearded woman guards the gods. Many bearded women, extravagant mysteries in stone, endure elegant and imposing with disdain for the puzzled. O Hatshepsut, the queen who would be king, she of styluses and swords who styled herself thus, obeying the rules of the ruled in which only kings figured. Hatshepsut, you still could not bend the adamant reality with your mythopoeic metal. Your name on the obelisks stays erased by the treacherous orders of the one who came after you, the one who could not bear without bristling with impotent anger and greed your queer attitude of command, your unmaker, your husband's son. So actually, there were a lot of obelisks carrying her name, which were actually erased.
I see.
Yeah. So I mean, it's very much based on chronicles and historical records, but it's also about, of course, the erasure of the woman queen. So, and the queer woman queen, actually, in some ways.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want me to read one more, or should we carry on into the conversation?
What would you like to do?
I could maybe read just one more, and then
Sure.
then maybe read, if the occasion arises while we are talking.
Sure.
Yeah? Okay, so maybe I'll read this one. I mean, I've actually marked out a few here, but yeah, I think this one is probably good to read. Moonwalking, or the Genealogy of Movement. This is to Michael Jackson when he died. Moonwalking, or the Genealogy of Movement. Fearing the sudden sting of father's hands, my walk learned the permanence of precision. Fearing the gravity of growing up, my voice remained thin, reed-like. In fear of the whiplashes that rained ceaseless on my ancestors' back, my slave walk became a tiptoe. In fear of the unseen dark of black, my skin went white, bloodless. Fearing the roars of my millionth fan, I hid my mates in a closet. Then, to put an end to the constant hide and seek with fierce ghouls, I shut up all my spooks behind the tall walls of Neverland, and shadowless, like a black cat, without letting drop a footfall, I moonwalked away from myself. I could read more when,
Yes.
when we're talking, yeah?
Yes. But I mean, thank you so much for that very scene setting kind of sequence that you assembled from the collection. And speaking of collection, The very first poem is Folk Tongue, a preface, which really
Well,
set
that's
me.
the preface, actually. That's not a poem.
Yeah.
That's the preface. The preface is in verse. That's all.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a lovely one. It's a beautiful poem in itself.
Thank you.
So normally we have prefaces to memoirs, in a manner of speaking, among other texts, which also invites the intriguing question whether this book in some way is a memoir in verse, although as verse does, it tells its slant to some extent.
I wouldn't quite say so, Sohit, because I think the one thing I try to do is not to really have so much of so much of the self in poetry, right? I mean, because there is one misconception, unfortunately, it's a very popular misconception about poetry in general, that somehow that which is not lyrical. I mean, when we call something a lyric, it makes it alludes to the self, right?
Yes.
So there is a sort of popular misconception about poetry itself that somehow that it's a lot of it is about experience, a lot of it is about the self, a lot of it is the self speaking without self speaking transparently almost, right? And that is one thing I actually tried to get away from by inventing others to speak through, right? And sometimes inventing others to speak through, sometimes of course writing very public political poetry. So I'm not very sure that I would call this a memoir, even though of course, I mean, any sort of collection I would think would tell a story of the growth of the self, or the evolution of the self, or the journey of the self, maybe.
Absolutely.
Right? So there is that aspect for sure, of moving, even though the poems are not in chronological order, right? I mean, they're not in the order that I wrote them. We'll talk about that in a bit. What was the organizing principle for this in some sense, but I would not quite call this a memoir, even though it does, it's a bit like, I would say it's a bit like looking at somebody's library, right? I think that's one of the most intimate acts that any person can share with another, to show them their library. It's a bit like walking through their head. What have they read? What are they interested in? What are they, so it's, so I mean, so if it is a memoir, if at all we can call this a memoir, then it is in the sense of walking through my library. Not
Right.
in the sense of
Walking through your life.
Yeah, not bearing the soul, shall we say?
Of course. And now, in fact, my very next question is about the fact that there is a multiplicity of voices, of narrators, many of them, or even most of them, female voices. So there's Hatshepsut, there are others who are not named, but who are. Can you tell us a little bit about exactly this? In a sense, you half answered the question already in the previous answer.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate a little?
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is I am going to read actually that other poem from Travels in the Hereafter, which is written in the voice of Mary. Right?
Yes.
It is written in the voice of.
Yes.
I mean, if you remember, there is the episode
Absolutely.
in the Bible of Mary and Joseph with infant Jesus fleeing to Egypt to get away from Herod's, looking for this baby. So, and this possibly is actually the most feminine poem I've ever written, or something like that. But but I'll read this one, and then I'll speak a little about that the idea that you is presented of the personae, and what is the nature of, or what is the reason for the selection of that personae, and what's the nature of it.
Yes.
So this is poem 4 from the sequence Travels in the Hereafter, Fleeing to Egypt. We do not tarry on the treacherous desert sand that swirls about us as we labor towards the land of exiles. The donkey, laden with my new bulges, and our newborn eternally wailing on my swollen chest above an aching belly. and my husband, who's too naive to believe those angelic dreams. Thirst prickles our throats like cacti, closing in on us, populous and sly, and the cold wind slices through us, a scuttling scorpion tail in the moonlight. My birthing sores throb like the heartbeat of my defenseless infant, who dreams yet of manna and honey and smells of myrrh. What can wise men know of a mother's sorrow? News trickled in the cave like dripping icicles of the children massacred in wrath in place of my unknowing son. And I wept the rootless tears only a young mother can, of remorse and relief wrought. Rachel's womb laments in my sleep because they are not. And the cold cave racks me in shivers of panic and dread. Even my dreams thud with the unrelenting hoofs that herald Herod, that insecure man who lacked no hairs. It is thus, dear people, that I learned to brace my heart, for I knew sorrow upon sorrow comes in this child's wake, pursuing us through Galilee, Jerusalem, and Nazareth, until I would rock his bruised body on my empty lap. Now about about writing in person. I mean, this is, I haven't done very much of that, even though that is, as I said, in some sense that's a stylistic choice one makes, not to have too much of the self there, but to speak in tongues.
Of course.
Speak it actually, here actually the folk tongue becomes a different kind of folk tongue.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you do have you create that folk tongue for that distance between the self and the character one is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
It's true that some of the poems are, I would like to think of myself actually not so much as a woman poet, but a poet. I mean, I do have a problem with this rubric of, woman poet. I mean, we don't say woman carpenter or
Nope.
man carpenter or man scientist and woman, man engineer, woman engineer. So why woman poet, right? So it's a poet is a poet is a poet. So, right. And one of my favorite poets who happen to be woman is Wisława Szymborska. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is that she's not concerned so much about writing as a woman, right? I mean, I'm not saying that she doesn't. Of course, she does. Quite often she does, but that in some sense that's kind of accidental. I mean, it's almost like a novelist taking on different voices, right?
Yes.
Voices of different genders, voices of different different kinds of social groups or right identities.
Yeah.
So I would not quite say. I mean, of course, I mean I am a woman, so there is the womanly or whatever. There is. I do speak as a woman clearly. However, that rubric of the feminine voice or the woman's voice or whatever, I'm not exactly sure that's where I want to go with presenting these personae. I mean, these could very well be presented by a male writer, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
yeah, like G. Thile's new book, right? Names of women, which are these women characters from the Bible. So you're not necessarily limited by your gender in that sense.
Absolutely not.
So yeah.
So in fact, it's uncanny because the next question I was going to ask was about fleeing to Egypt.
Okay.
But if I were to briefly ask you about the inception of the book, were these poems? What was the time frame? Across which the poems were written? Were they written? In English? Are some of them translations, self-translations, or from Malayalam? Or can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's quite intriguing, because you write in two languages when most of us, write only in one. So I'd be very interested to know how that process works for you.
Yeah, so these are actually poems written over a long period, because I think one of the earliest poems here, I don't quite know how to date it, but it does go back to late 90s, late
Okay.
1990s. Okay, so it is actually these are actually in some sense selections from what I've actually written. I was quite ruthless with myself as an editor, and left out a lot of junk basically. And there is, I mean, I would like to think that there is a certain way in which I have ordered these poems, right? So I mean, one of the when I was putting these poems together, so these are written over different periods, in different places, as different people almost. I mean, it's a long period. 20 odd years is a long period to have been writing, and then to be putting those together as a collection. So in some sense, I actually organized this like a musical album, right? So you'll see that there is a certain way in which the tonalities shift, right? And so if there is a or one or two or three slightly high poems, then you're immediately brought down by a low poem, right? So there, and then there is a rising, and so there is a kind of rise and fall in the tone in the poems. I haven't quite put it together as personal, but there is a very clear. It's not that clear, maybe, but there is I do attempt to write the private as well as the public, right? The political self.
Yes.
So it's not as if all the private poems are together and all the public poems are together. No, because
No.
I mean, that's just too much of one thing.
Yeah.
Right? So you need to, so how I organize this in some sense is by thinking of this more in terms of songs in a musical album, and then where would I go with that, right? And if these came to me to be assembled, how would I assemble it? So I had to distance myself as the writer and look at it more as an editor or a conductor, maybe. I'm not very sure, but I had to take on some other role to actually conceive of the book as the book, right? I mean, I do believe that individual poems don't necessarily work together always as a book. So in order to make it work as a book, how do you put them together? So there are certain choices I've made also in terms of what can go into this book, right? So there is,
Yes.
So there is a certain, I mean, I would like to think that there is an organizing principle behind it. And in some sense, some of those shifts are marked by the beautiful line drawings by Madhu. So, so you do see the shift happening with each page of a line drawing.
Got it.
That there is a sort of shift that happens. So, yeah.
Fabulous. So since the 90s till now, and are some of these poems, were they written in English? Are some translations from Malayalam? How does that go?
There is a very small number which are there in both.
Yeah.
Now, so this is actually a very interesting question. I mean, I was asked this question earlier by a South African interviewer for Poetry Potion. How do you, because I mean, South Africa is again another place where a lot of people write in two languages. There are people writing in two languages, right? I mean, they may be writing in Xhosa and English, or Zulu and English, or whatever. So writing and performing in both. So this question becomes quite interesting, right? I mean, the folk tongue. Of course, we have our own absolute greats in bilingual poetry, like Arun Kolatkar. There is an Arun Kolatkar, there is a Dilip Chitre, right? I mean, so there are, we do have some examples of people writing actually in two, and of course, self-translations, we have several examples. For me, actually, so some of the poems are translatable between languages and some are not. Many are not, in fact, so it's a kind of difficult choice one makes the choice is not about which language to write in, because the poem chooses the language.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, when the poem occurs to you, it's already happening in a language. So it's not so much about the writing, but also, you know, what can work in another language. You know, it's often not that obvious what works and what doesn't. I mean, often it is actually obvious, because you know, let's say there's a particular metrical pattern, or there are completely untranslatable cultural references, right? So I have a poem called Utsavam, which is festival, but you know, it uses so much of the Chenda beat, and you know, it's like so much of there's so much of Malayalam, of both the Malayalam as a language and the culture there, that I don't think I'll ever be able to transcreate that in English.
Got it.
So the few poems which are there in both Malayalam, which exist in both English and Malayalam, are in some sense, they're the translatable ones, but also these are not translations. When I do my own poem in another language, what I do is I use the original as a kind of takeoff point, you know. So I mean, if we can call, so the second one also becomes an original. Basically, there is no, it's not exactly a translation, but a base for a poem in the other language, because you know, I would like to believe that I pay a lot of attention to language and its precision. So it's not, so sometimes, you know, words just don't, it doesn't create a poem in the other language when you just translated and strung these words together in a translation. It doesn't necessarily work as a original poem in the other language. So yeah, so I tried to kind of get the essence of the poem and, you know, and rework that into an entirely new poem, actually, almost.
Wonderful, wonderful.
So the forked tongue, yeah.
The forked tongue. And you know, I was about to just get to the political parts of the poem, of the collection, and there are, you know, some beautiful, moving, frank, forthright, sensitively dealt poems, such as Stones, which takes us to Kashmir, the cartography of survival, which talks about Palestine, specifically the Gaza Strip. You know, the brutal nature of colonization, of grabbing someone's country and calling it yours, from the point of view of the people who are at the butt end of the treatment. Can you just maybe lead us into that poemscape?
Do you want me to read Stones, or it's slightly
whichever
longer?
You like, whichever you like.
Actually, let me read neither of these two, but yet another one. No, do not go there. Now that's actually kind of, you know, that's because that also speaks through references to other poets, etc. So yeah, no, do not go there. This was actually, so this is, you know, I mean, there is the occupation of Kashmir, that you know, that which is the occasion for writing Stones, and this is of course also immediately after a lot of people were killed and blinded, especially children, for throwing stones at the Indian army. And so you know, in some sense, it's a protest poem, or trying to actually understand the Kashmir situation. And the Gaza poem is also kind of, right. I mean, it's so these are both written from, in some sense, places that are occupied or places that are colonized, or places where people would like freedom from the state, right, from an authoritarian state. But I take you into another one, which is actually written not from the location of the colonized place, but from the colonizer's space, right? So or the, you know, or the imperial space. This one is No, Do Not Go There. It was written after the terror attacks in France in 2015. No, do not go there. The pendulum of the basilica clock is a bomb that will go off the moment you step on the bell tower's hunchbacked staircase, winding its way to the sky, crisscrossed by drones over Beirut and Aleppo and Baghdad, cities of fevered fairy tale dreams, now but cries of John the Baptist's head on a platter, dusted with the pain of the apostate and the infidel. No, do not go there. The refugee child's shoes, stained by the perilous salt water of the ocean she tried to cross, to find a home elsewhere where there is no war, as they play their war games only outside their borders, pressing the buttons of kill and burn and smash and bomb and kill till the war reluctantly comes to their cafes. And a football match turns bloody, and music stops playing the tunes of liberté, égalité. There was never fraternity in any case, not even a pretense to love your neighbor, but kill the joy of play and sport in the schools of Kabul and Gaza and Cairo and Jerusalem, where every supper could be the last, where every candle is lit for the dead, where every prayer is a cry of the living, where every string is tuned to a requiem, where every utterance is a protest and poetry of Hikmet, of Darwish, of Faiz, of Mir. Do not go there. I chose to read this one rather than the other two, rather than either of the others, or Vinayak Sen for that matter. I chose to read this also because I think, here in this poem, there may be something happening in terms of space, right? I mean, while staying in one place, while staying in Notre Dame and the hunchbacked staircases of the Notre Dame Cathedral, it still, while staying there, it's looking at a lot outside itself, right? I mean, there's a kind of multiplicity, it's not, there is a heterogeneity of spaces that kind of coalesce in an imperial space. So which also makes actually a sort of protest possible from within that imperial space, right? So I think it's not accidental that this poem is actually written from an imperial space. It also makes that articulation possible in some sense, that you can write about places where every supper could be the last. In a so far imperial space, which has now got threatened by the violence it itself has, in some sense, been responsible for or been the origin of. So yeah, so it brings together, Aleppo, Baghdad, Kabul, Jerusalem. It brings all these places into Paris and into Nice and into, so there is that heterogeneity, which actually is quite it's quite interesting that you actually mentioned earlier about the multiplicity of voices, right? So I mean, this is actually something that I'm really attracted by in others' writings as well. So it's a sort of polyglossary, if one can call it that, right? Being multiple languages, multiple places, multiple personas, all of which kind of, in some sense, also by the very nature of its heterogeneity, and is already heteroglossic, and it already actually creates a space of resistance,
right,
to that one authoritative something, right? Whether it's a language, whether it's a place, whether it's a tradition, whether it's the more you have, the
right,
more, yeah.
Right. So speaking of which, I want to just take a segue out. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Insurrections Ensemble?
Okay, so there's actually a section of poems in this book, which are songs written for the Insurrections Ensemble project. Now, the Insurrections Ensemble project began in 2010. It's a collaboration between South African and Indian poets and musicians, and the final product of these collaborations are 5 albums, 5 musical albums. Many of them published along with actually a booklet of the poems. So typically, so this is directed by the South African poet Ari Cetus in Cape Town, and Sumangala Damodaran, singer, economist based in India. So it's a big ensemble. Actually, we have there are members who've been there right from the start, and there are also guest members who come and go. So we do have the sitar, the sarangi, we do have the sarod, the sarangi, etc. from India, and we have various bows and various kinds of instruments from South Africa, and also things like the electric guitar, which is played by by fabulous jazz musicians in the ensemble. And there's also the double bass, etc. So it's a big ensemble. Typically, there are like 12 or 13 people on stage when we are performing. So it's and many of them with all kinds of instruments. The project actually is something that was conceived when we saw when we were all despairing about rising authoritarianism in different parts of the world, which were occurring simultaneously, right? I mean, there's Trump in the US and or something leading to Trump in the US anyway at that time, and Brexit in England, and there was the rise of the BJP here, and so there was a kind of question on how do we as creative practitioners respond to this. But that wasn't the only thing. There was also it was also very much a musical exploration of links between South African and Indian modes of musicality, actually. So it's both a musical project and a project in word music, as well as in some sense solidarity. So we have 5 albums. So typically we have a certain thematic thing in mind. So it could be refugees, it could be migration, it could be just insurrections, it could be just protest, it could be. And one of the albums actually was a sort of adaptation of Shakespeare's Tempest into a more post-colonial re-envisioning of not quite the empire writing back, but a bit of that maybe. So there is so it has as its location, even though it's located in South Africa and India, it also has as its location multiple imperial or colonized spaces, or multiple places of articulation of resistance in some sense. So the songs of insurrections, I mean, I've written actually in both Malayalam and English for that project. So Mangala also sings in Malayalam. So so we have actually tried to keep it absolutely multilingual. So there's also Xhosa, there's isiZulu, there's so we have tried to create actually a sort of musical and poetic response to our times, really. So that's how that project has gone.
Right. So it's people singing.
Yes, there are singers, and there are
there's also recitation.
Multiplicity of instruments.
Okay.
And there may be spoken word as well. So it's a kind of
wonderful. Sounds very exciting.
Yeah, you can actually check it out on Spotify. Insurrections Ensemble. If you type into Spotify, you can see that. Yeah, you'll have access to all 5 albums. Actually.
Fabulous. Looking forward to it. Which of course sets up the next question, which were some of the poems in the insurrection sequence.
Mm-hmm.
Can you take us through that sequence a little?
Oh, really? Okay.
If you like. In particular,
they're much better sung, of course.
Of course they are.
The problem with me reading from it is that in my head I hear Tina Scow or Sumangala or somebody singing these verses actually.
Yeah.
So
In fact, my
okay,
favorite,
I'll read one. I'll read one from that.
my favorite from the sequence, of course, is the first one, which is the earthworms one.
The earthworms. Yeah. No, the earthworms actually is a kind of spoken word. It was never sung.
I see.
So, yeah. So do you want me to read that? That's a very long one. I think we'll skip that. People may get a little restless. Well, actually, I'll read one just to indicate how this, these of course are written. Some of them, as I said, are spoken words, so they're not intended necessarily to be sung. But some of them, when one might write already for it to be sung, or it may be a poem that's kind of broken and tortured into or whatever. It's completely made into something that can be sung. So so you might find actually rather easy kind of rhymes, etc. in these, because they're also meant to be sung. But yeah, I'll just read the second one. Maybe it's very short. Mourning the insurrection. And now this is, of course, I hear it in my head in Tina Skau's beautiful voice. Beautifully sung poem this is. And when I read it, it will probably lose all its power. But yeah, mourning the so this is from Songs of Insurrections, Mourning the Insurrection. They come with lathis and bayonets of silk, as the sun beats down its rays all worn, and we fall, each one, Jack, King and Queen, a 1 and a 2, a lean, hungry 10, cards in a pack, the red and the black and the red, when the flowers bled, the colors of the dead, the colors of the dead. This is only one, and this is beautifully sung actually, Martina. So it's horrendous to be reading it out like this in my Besura voice. But
it also lends itself pretty well to being read, in my opinion.
Oh, okay.
Because of
that's
the
very
rhythm.
Generous, Suhit.
No, the rhythm does lend itself and rhymes very powerful, and in my opinion, a sadly neglected tool or effect.
Yeah, but so what I think many of us do is actually create some kind of internal sound patterns.
Right? Yeah.
There may be internal rhymes, or there may be internal sound patterns which are not necessarily rhymes, but
yeah. Yes, assonances and consonances, and which in your case, entire syllables are the subject of consonances in many poems.
I used to think that that one is paying attention to sound here, because ultimately, actually, poetry. I mean, this may be actually a very generalized kind of view, but I think ultimately poetry came from song, right? I mean, poetry and song were the same, whether it's Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, or whatever. Think of all the Puranas, think of all the it's poetry was sung.
Yeah.
And it's kind of good to remember that, I think, when we write, sometimes, maybe not always, maybe it's not always necessary. There are obviously different kinds of poems, but it's still good to kind of keep in mind maybe that, that sound is where it all originated from, right? And sound actually being so primal, whether it's the beat of a drum or, or a cry, or so it's sound being so primal. It's there is something that's that sound patterns do in a poem that really cannot be expressed in any other way except through sound, right? So it's it brings actually something to poetry which is actually very unique and very its own,
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of,
actually why this whole experiment was very this whole experience, this working with the insurrections theme, has been an absolute eye-opener for me in terms of also bringing me much closer to understanding the absolute links between musicality and language, and quite a challenge sometimes, of course. I mean, to twist what you've written into something that can be sung, etc., etc. And sometimes, actually, when you're writing, you already have, let's say, a particular raga in mind, or a particular. I mean, if I'm writing in Malayalam, I may have a raga in mind, or a particular tune, a melody in mind, or something. I mean, you already have some. Okay, this can work. You already see the possibility of it.
Yeah.
In
Absolutely.
turning into music. So it's a fabulous. I think it's probably an exercise which is good for a lot of poets to do.
Yeah.
To try and to try out the sound.
Yeah, absolutely. To read it aloud, for instance, and stuff like that.
That too, very much. Yeah.
Um,
There are poems which may work better on the page. And I'm not talking about performance poetry now. That's a completely different thing. I mean, I don't think any of my poems actually work as performance poetry. They are poems that work on the page.
Right.
And,
right.
And when it's read out from the page, sometimes it may work, but they're not necessarily.
No.
Yeah.
So then there are also songs addressed, to return to an earlier question in a different way. There are also these poems addressed to elders, to your father, K. Satchidanandan, and Nabanita Dev Sen. And they are conversations, right? They are speaking to them. And there, in fact, there is a whole sequence where of poems addressed to your father. And they take us to various themes. They take us through, but I'd rather listen to it from you than tell it myself.
Which let me just think of which one to read from these. Okay, maybe I'll actually then read. This is from the sequence Letters to Father. Fragment 4, Storms. Or should I? Yeah, okay. Now this is actually directly in response to one of my father's poems called Synonyms of Rain, Marayuda Nanartham in Malayalam. And now this poem this entire sequence is only in English. It doesn't exist in Malayalam.
Okay.
But it is kind of speaking to it's addressing a particular Malayalam poem of my father's called Marayuda Nanartham, or the Synonyms of Rain, which is actually a highly celebrated poem in Malayalam, and very, very oft quoted and rapturously remembered. I mean, the Malayalam reading public, of course, is also a very vocal reading public. So it's kind of, this is a poem that's there in everybody's, at the tip of everybody's tongue, actually, the moment it starts raining. So it actually celebrates, the poem celebrates the southern Indian monsoon in its various amazing sounds and smells and all of that. So this is in some sense, this is the daughter writing back to the father about a possible interpretation, another possible interpretation of the rain. Fragment 4, Storms. Let us de-romanticize storms, Father, unlyric them and unlearn the ways of how birds scatter and winds gather and yakshis descend with rain's long hair. When the sparks blow the circuit board and the water pools on the table, soaking the spines of books unread, and with a mop, your back bent, you wipe in a furious sweep, trying to dry the dyed spines as you hear afar the gale smashing the windscreen of your car. And you slip on the damp floor, and all you can ever think of is how not to be the goddess of your fragile home. See it bursting at its brittle, spittle bitter seams, and long for that rust red room of your own, the blues. These two, Father, are the many synonyms of rain.
Beautiful. Beautiful.
So this actually totally addresses not only addresses a certain a very particular work by a particular person, but also a certain tradition of writing, right? I mean, so the poem in a way attempts to de-romanticize poetic language itself. It's not just de-romanticizing the rain, but by attempting to do that, it's also kind of in a very prosaic way, right? I mean, sparks are blowing the circuit board and stuff like that is happening while it's raining. So so through a very prosaic intervention, it also tries to de-unlyric poetry itself. I mean, I think that's been the attempt, at least.
Wonderful, wonderful. And of course, poems addressed to Nabanita Dev Sen. I think there are quite a few there.
There are two. There are two or three here. I mean, I've written a few, but I think there are two or three here. Maybe I could read actually that one poem from, which also kind of this will be the last poem I'll read probably. It also kind of, this was written actually when she passed away. Going Home. So Nabanita Dev Sen, Bengali poet. So I do have this habit of writing to other poets living or non-living. I've written poems to Nabanita Dev when she was alive, but this was written after she passed away in 2019. So she was also a Ramayana scholar, so therefore you'll see the certain allusions here also come from the fact that she was a Ramayana scholar. Going Home to Nabanita Dev Sen. What is this skin, the weave that unravels itself? What is this voice that turns hoarse, then falls silent? What this movement, the agitation that goes still? We leave behind words, the lingering warmth of love, the breath that joins all other breaths, the particles that disperse to make others. You have made us, you make us. You are the earth needed while moist, formed in fire, kindled by air that joins air, reborn every moment. You are the mother, you return to mother. Sita, free at last from testimonies of mere men, remembers the plow, recalls the earth of which she is born, knows that Bhumi has infinite room on her lap to hold her.
Wonderful.
So
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah, so it's I think when I write to others, there is an attempt to address them in their multiple kinds of lives, not just as poets, but it could be something alluding to their personal life. It could be their work. It could be, so there is that attempt to pay homage to the whole person, actually.
Fantastic, fantastic. So with that, we are almost out of time. Sabita, thank you so much for giving us your time and for giving me the chance to read your book. I loved it. And I wish it and you the very best of luck. So guys, this was Pen at Prithvi, fortnightly platform online. We talk to writers about their work. Do follow us for regular fortnightly updates. Bye, Sabita. Love chatting.
Thank you so much, Suhit, and thank you, Prithvi, Pen at Prithvi, for this fabulous conversation. And it was a pleasure talking to you, Suhit, also because you're a poet yourself. So I think a lot of your insight in your questions actually came from not just a very broad reading of poetry, but also your own engagement as a writer. So
thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Pleasure talking to you. Thank you.